I think we would kid ourselves if we think that there's any real sort of nostalgic affection on Donald Trump's side for the UK. Yes, he has his golf courses here. Yes, he likes to tell stories about the late Queen. I don't think we can count on any special deals, any special relationship with the Trump administration.
Now, it's less than 2 weeks until America chooses its next president, and foreign policy isn't a deciding factor for most American voters. But when President Biden leaves the White House early next year, could it spell bad news for the special relationship and indeed the broader transatlantic relationship, not just with the UK, but Europe as a whole? We know Donald Trump is sceptical about the NATO alliance, and Kamala Harris looks to have less of an affinity with Europe than her predecessor. Here's Joe Biden talking recently about his long relationship with Germany.
I think it's fair to say, although I know I only look like I'm 40 years old, I've seen a wide sweep of history. When I was born, our countries were at war. As a young senator, I visited West Berlin and saw what it meant to live in a divided city, country, and continent. And then in 1989, like millions of people around the world, I saw 70,000 brave souls gathered in Leipzig, crying out for freedom. And the Berlin Wall came down.
Now, that was Joe Biden speaking in Berlin, but could that be the last transatlantic loving from a US president we see in a while? I'm joined by Lord Ricketts, the former diplomat and former national security advisor. Good morning, Lord Ricketts.
Good morning to you.
Now, we've heard from that clip, and I think it's obvious, not least because of his age, that Joe Biden feels a real affinity with Berlin and is very invested in the politics of Europe and the security of Europe. You've written that the president has transatlantic relations in his DNA. Is that necessarily true for, certainly not true for Donald Trump, but is it necessarily true for the new generation of Democrats who are taking his place, not least Kamala Harris?
No, I don't think it will be true for them for the generational reason you give. Joe Biden was first a senator in 1973, right in the heart of the Cold War. He's crisscrossed the Atlantic ever since. He's very familiar with the whole European security scene. He used to come to the Munich Security Conference, the big love-in of the security community every year in Germany. Of course, then he was vice president for 8 years. So he knows in great detail the issues of European security, the threat from Russia, NATO's response to it. And I think we owe quite a lot of the early reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to Joe Biden's familiarity with all those issues, the reinforcement of Europe by American troops, and so on. No future American president will come in with that background, that's clear. Kamala Harris, of course, understands the importance of NATO and will be a good ally, but she's a Californian. In the Senate Intelligence Committee, her focus was on the tech threat from China. So she is not she doesn't have, to use your word, the affinity that Joe Biden had, nor I think will any likely successor from now on, because the Americans have grown away from Europe.
And you, as a former diplomat, former national security advisor, have worked with countless politicians from across the world. How significant, sort of explain to listeners who haven't been in the meetings that you have and had the sort of conversations you've had with politicians, when crisis hits or politicians are thinking about global security, how important is that sort of sense of affinity, empathy, innate understanding that goes beyond, briefings for ambassadors and that sort of thing? How significant is it in terms of policy? I mean, you've just spoken about Ukraine, but is it decisive in the way that you say?
Well, I think in times of crisis, it's important that leaders should be able to get together, should understand what to do. And NATO has been the place where European transatlantic leaders, Americans, Canadians, have come together year after year, and they understand the kind of reactions that are necessary in a crisis. And I think, given that there are so many other crises in the world, if you look at the confrontation with China, America turns to a different set of allies, really, to handle China. People like the Australians. In the Middle East, Europeans have been rather less present than the British and the Americans have been. And so I think that instinct to get around an alliance table to share with partners has been particularly true through my career because of the Cold War, because of the ever-present threat from Russia. And I think it will get more dissipated from here on in. We've got more nationalism, we've got more protectionism. Even the Biden administration and the future Harris administration would have the protection of American jobs and the American economy at the top of their agenda. So the instinctive internationalism that I grew up with, I think, is less strong now.
Let's turn to Donald Trump. It feels like a good moment, given what you've just said, to turn to the prospect of a second Trump presidency. Now, we know broadly that he is a world away from what Joe Biden thinks about European defence and NATO. He's always had a bit of a soft spot for Britain, not least because of his Scottish mother. He says he spoke very proudly and probably inaccurately recently about being the Queen's favourite US president, the late Queen's favourite US president. Is there in that sort of affinity for Britain a chink of light for the Western alliance? Can a Labour government try and influence or talk round Donald Trump to a more pragmatic position on Ukraine, on European defence? Or is the row we've seen this week about foreign interference and his erratic style, to put it politely, likely to mean that nobody can be that transatlantic bridge?
Well, I think we would kid ourselves if we think that there's any real sort of nostalgic affection on Donald Trump's side for the UK. Yes, he has his golf courses here. Yes, he likes to tell stories about the late Queen. I don't think we can count on any special deals, any special relationship with the Trump administration. I don't honestly think that the Labour volunteers to the Democrat campaign is more than a storm in a teacup. It was a piece of performative, fury from the Trump campaign in an election. But I think he would put the UK in the same basket as other Europeans. As you said, he's no fan of NATO. He thinks NATO is a con trick on the Americans, that they do all the paying and the Europeans get all the security. I mean, there was some truth in that 10 or 15 years ago. The Europeans were not paying their way in NATO. Since the war in Ukraine, actually, European defense spending has come up quite significantly. So there is a good argument to make to Trump that actually his pressure 5-6 years ago did lead to an improvement in European defense spending. But big picture, I mean, I think Trump is going to be tempted to do a deal over the heads of Ukraine with Putin. That's going to go down very badly in Europe if he succeeds. And in the Middle East, who knows what he will do? He's so unpredictable. And I think the chink of light you're looking for actually is in his unpredictability. I mean, really, I don't think anybody can tell what his foreign policy will be. In the last time round, his rhetoric was far sharper than his actions. So I don't think he's going to, go to war with Iran on Israel's side, for example. And his actions with China were always less adversarial than his rhetoric. So I think we'll see how he settles into office the second time if it's him. He will be a more effective Trump than the first time around because he'll know the office. But I don't think we should give up hope that we can encourage him to see that the allies are important for America and that America has a vested interest in some stability in the world, not just a kind of transactional, adversarial attitude to every other country.
Well, Lord Ricketts, the former diplomat and former national security advisor, thank you very much